Office's Budget and Economic Outlook. I want to welcome our witness today, the Director of the Congressional Budget Office, Dr. Philip Swagel. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to be with us today. I will now yield myself 5 minutes for my opening statement. Good morning once again. And once again, welcome to Dr. Swagel, who is testifying before our committee for the first time as the Director of the Congressional Budget Office. I would also like to take a moment to thank Director Swagel and all the dedicated staff at CBO for their hard work and their commitment to being a nonpartisan, indispensable partner to Congress. In 2019 alone, CBO worked diligently to publish more than 700 cost estimates and nearly 80 analytic reports, working papers, and testimonies. While the compendium of CBO's work is invaluable to our work here in Congress, our annual hearing on the budget and economic outlook is always enlightening as we begin a new session of Congress. Yesterday, CBO released its report unveiling its projections for the next decade. Unfortunately, the report once again confirms that despite the economic expansion he inherited, the fiscal outlook has worsened since President Trump took office. Director Swagel, you project a deficit this year that is more than $1 trillion, and over the next decade, deficits are projected to rise. The national debt is expected to reach 98% of GDP by 2030, the highest ratio since World War II. Under President Trump, deficits have risen to heights not usually seen outside of recessions and major world wars. They have increased every year, an unusual trend given that deficits tend to fall with the unemployment rate. In fact, the deficit in 2019 was the highest since 2012, when we were recovering from the Great Recession and the unemployment rate was 8%, more than double the rate today. As a result of these deficits, the national debt has climbed higher and faster than CBO projected at the end of the Obama administration. Now, on their face, these fiscal facts might not be so concerning if we were using whatever fiscal space we have to make critical investments while interest rates are low to address the multitude of deficits we face in the real economy. Crumbling infrastructure, skyrocketing healthcare costs, widening student achievement gaps, a warming climate, lower life expectancy. In light of these and other problems, it's difficult to escape the conclusion that we should be making bolder investments in American families and our nation's future. But unfortunately, that's not the reality. The reality is that President Trump drove up deficits to instead gift the wealthy and corporations with a $1.9 trillion tax cut. At least we thought it would be only $1.9 trillion. As we will learn today, it's substantially more than that. But that's $1.9 trillion that had little meaningful impact on the economy. $1.9 trillion that could have been, but was not, put toward making childcare more affordable, a college education more accessible, and retirement security more achievable for American families. Our economy and budget face difficult times ahead. An aging population and rising health care costs mean economic growth is projected to be slower and deficits are expected to be larger going forward. As we learned from our previous hearing, a warming climate will increasingly stress our nation's budget. Meanwhile, we will need to make investments in our infrastructure, education, and job training if we hope to compete in the global economy. CBO's report shows that there is a real need to address our fiscal issues over the next several decades, and the solution will require a balanced approach and a fair tax system. As chairman of the committee, I have stressed that we need to think seriously about severe and persistent deficits in the real economy, not just deficits in the budget. That doesn't mean that we can spend tax dollars without thought or discretion, but it does require that we use our nation's resources more wisely than this administration has. It means prioritizing policies that will help modernize our economy, prepare our communities for the opportunities of the future, and help more American families get ahead in this economy. Director Swagel, thank you for being here once again, and I look forward to hearing your testimony. I now yield 5 minutes to the ranking member for his opening statement.
I thank the chairman for holding this hearing. Director Swagel, thank you for your service, and we look forward to your testimony here today. I sure hope the country is paying attention to what's going to be discussed here today. As we're all aware, yesterday the CBO released its annual baseline, confirming what we already know. Our country is on an unsustainable fiscal trajectory. Specifically, in fiscal 20, CBO expects the deficit will be $1 trillion plus, an increase of $31 billion from last year. It should be deeply unsettling to all of us here in this room that fiscal year 20 will be the first year since fiscal 12 that the deficit will eclipse $1 trillion. We're clearly headed in the wrong direction. Looking even further ahead, if we don't take action to get our fiscal house in order, the deficit will be $1 trillion by fiscal year 21, then rise to 1.7 plus trillion by fiscal 2030. Deficits will total 13 plus trillion over the budget window. This is unacceptable for this country. Our country's unsustainable deficits are driven by our largely by out-of-control mandatory spending, which includes daunting interest payments on our debt, even at low rates. Mandatory spending currently accounts for about 70% of the federal budget, and by the end of the budget window, 76%. To put this in perspective, in the mid-1960s, just over a half century ago, spending in the mandatory columns accounted for just 34%. Because of the continued growth of our country's mandatory spending, federal spending will consume an ever-expanding share of economic resources. It will rise from 21% of GDP this year to 23.5% by 2030, vastly exceeding the 20.4% annual average of the past 50 years. Make no mistake, if we continue down this reckless path, CBO confirms that we will face the severe threat of a fiscal crisis which will negatively impact every single American. While Washington undoubtedly has a spending problem, our revenue growth remains pretty strong. CBO estimates federal revenue in fiscal 2020 will increase by $170 billion from the previous year. That's a record, reaching $3.6 trillion. Revenue is projected to grow to $5.7 trillion in fiscal 2030. You ought to be able to run a country on that kind of money. To further underscore this remarkable growth, by fiscal 26, revenues will exceed the historic average for revenues as a percentage of GDP. This upward trend continues through the end of the budget window. It's pretty clear that the government has a spending problem, not a revenue problem. While it's true that we're experiencing a period of historic economic prosperity and growth, the stark reality is that the consequences of our high and rising debt are severe. According to CBO's projections, the federal debt will grow faster than the economy in perpetuity, which of course is unsustainable. And this isn't just CBO's analysis. A few short months ago, right here in this very room, Federal Reserve Chairman Jay Powell testified before this committee, and he said our debt is growing faster than our economy by a margin. By definition, that is unsustainable. There's no way around it. Either Congress will put the federal budget on a sustainable course or a financial crisis will result. According to CBO, the current debt path increases the risk of a fiscal crisis, that is, a situation in which the interest rate on federal debt rises abruptly because investors have lost confidence in our U.S. government's fiscal position. We've heard about the reality of our fiscal trajectory time and time again, and yet it still seems as though my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are not taking those warnings seriously. Policies promoted by congressional Democrats would increase mandatory spending by tens of trillions of dollars, thus drastically adding to the national debt. The most notable unrealistic policy proposals that come to mind include Medicare for All and the Green New Deal. It is critical that Congress come together to address our daunting fiscal outlook, and yet Democrats continue to promote outrageously expensive policies with no way to pay for them. Our dire fiscal situation underscores the pressing importance of budget resolutions, which are supposed to come from this committee as a long-term financial plan for the country. Under Democrat control, our committee did not put a budget forward last year, and it doesn't appear as though we'll do one this year. In every business, every city, every state, a budget is done. Yet in the greatest country in the history of the world, we're not doing a budget. It is my hope that after hearing from CBO Director Swagel today, eyes will be open to the stark reality we face. We simply must start making tough budgetary decisions in order to put our country on a responsible fiscal path and deliver on our duty to the American people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back my time.
Thank you for your opening statement. In the interest of time, if any other members have opening statements, you may submit those statements in writing for the record. And And now it's my great honor to introduce once again Director Philip Swagel of CBO. Director Swagel, the floor is yours. You are recognized for 5 minutes, and I will be very liberal with the gavel, so take what time you need.
Okay. Many thanks, Chairman Yarmouth and Ranking Member Womack. Thank you very much for inviting me to testify on CBO's budget and economic update. And thank you both for your guidance and support during these first 7 months as director. And thank you to your staff as well for helping make sure that we're focused on supporting the Congress and the priorities of the Congress. So I'll start with an overview of our analysis of the budget and the economy. We project economic growth and job creation will continue over the coming decade, but also a worrisome trajectory for the federal budget. Not since World War II has the country seen deficits during times of low unemployment that are as large as those that we project, nor in the past century has the United States experienced large deficits for as long as we project. So let me start with the good news on the economy. We project real GDP will expand at a solid 2.2% this year, driving continued job creation and a historically low unemployment rate. We anticipate that consumer spending, spurred by rising wages and household wealth, will remain strong. We also expect business investment to rebound as several of the factors that weighed on businesses last year abate. So in our projections for the later years of the coming decade, GDP growth moderates and settles back to its maximum sustainable growth rate that we see as 1.7%. Now, that growth rate is lower than the historical average because of long-term demographic trends. The United States is an aging society, and that means the growth of our labor force will be slower in the future than it has been in the past. Okay? Now, let me turn now to the challenging fiscal situation. In our projections, the federal budget deficit is $1 trillion this year and averages $1.3 trillion per year between 2021 and 2030. The deficit widens from 4.6% of GDP in 2020 out to 5.4% in 2030. Now, over the past 50 years, the average annual deficit equaled 3% of GDP and was generally much lower when the economy was strong. Now, revenues are growing. If current laws did not change, which is the basis of our projection, federal revenues would rise from 16.4% of GDP in 2020 to 18% in 2030, and those projections reflect a scheduled increase in individual income taxes at the end of 2025, among other changes that are in current law. The challenge is that spending is projected to grow more than revenues, widening the gap between spending and revenues. In our projection, federal outlays climb from 21% of GDP to 23.4% of GDP over the next decade, and that growth in outlays reflects mainly increased spending for mandatory programs, and then also increased payments of interest on the federal debt. So the increase in mandatory outlays over the decade is from 12.9% of GDP to 15.2% of GDP. And again, that's attributable to the long-term demographic trend. It's to the aging of the population. A second factor is rising healthcare costs. You'll see in our report, we have healthcare costs rising more slowly than has been the case in the past, but still rising faster than overall GDP. So those two trends, aging and healthcare costs, affect Social Security and Medicare in particular. And we see those trends persisting beyond the 10-year budget horizon. The increase in interest spending, in net interest outlays over our baseline, it's caused by both large deficits and also what we see as rising interest rates over the 10 years and beyond after a period in which interest rates have been very low. The result of all this is that federal debt held by the public will rise from $31.4 trillion at the end of 2020 I'm sorry, federal debt held by the public will rise to $31.4 trillion at the end of 2030, and that's an amount equal to 98% of GDP. Now, at that point, in 2030, debt would be higher as a percentage of GDP than at any point since just after World War II, and the debt will be more than double what it has averaged over the past 50 years. We project that, again, the gap between spending and revenue will continue to widen, and that eventually the debt in our long-term projection, 30 years hence, would reach 180% of GDP by 2050, and that's well above the highest percentage ever recorded in the United States. And it would be headed higher after that. So that debt path would dampen economic output in the US, It would increase our interest payments to foreigners, since we borrow from foreigners. It would also elevate the risk of negative economic effects, whether slow-moving or sudden, such as a fiscal crisis. Now, to be sure, interest rates remain low today. There's time to address our fiscal challenges, and fiscal policy could be used as a tool to address other challenges facing the nation if the Congress chooses to do so. But our debt is on an unsustainable path, and over time, we must address this fiscal challenge. So to conclude, the US economy is doing well with low unemployment and rising wages that have drawn people off the sidelines and back into the labor force, but the economy's performance makes the large and growing deficit all the more noteworthy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your testimony. We will now begin our question and answer session. As a reminder, members can submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and the witnesses' answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any members who wish to submit questions for the record may do so within 7 days. As we usually do, the ranking member and I will defer our questions until the end. So I now recognize Mr. Higgins of New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of things. Since 2003, when the United States went into, invaded and occupied Iraq, at that time, the United States economy was 8.5 times larger than that of China. Today, China's economy is, in some measures, larger than the United States. And the difference is that the United States, in some estimates, spent $1.9 trillion in Iraq. That's $6,300 per person, with a population of 327 million people. China, on the other hand, invested in the growth of their own economy, which catapulted them to a point where the Chinese economy grew by about 8.5%. Each year since 2003, the United States economy, I was just kind of adding it up, I didn't quite get there, but we're hovering about maybe 2 to 2.4%. You know, we had a tax cut bill that was approved in December of 2017. And the White House Council of Economic Advisors issued a report. And they said that each American household would realize an annual increase in household income because of this tax cut of between $4,000 and $9,000. Is there any evidence that that has actually occurred?
We haven't tallied the dollars per household. We did a comprehensive analysis in April 2018.
Is there any evidence that it's close?
The tax cut has raised GDP, and so we see the level of GDP is about 1% higher, but we haven't apportioned that.
What's the
per
GDP
household.
growth right now?
We see GDP growth coming in this year at about 2.4%
So
last year and 2.2%
Okay,
this year.
2.4%. So what you're saying is it would have been 1.4% without the tax cut?
We see that the level of GDP is higher. The growth rate impact is maybe 2 or 0.3% per year.
Well, that's different from 1%.
So the level of GDP is higher.
Okay,
The incomes are higher, but the growth rate is.
Okay, I'm confused. All right.
I apologize.
All right, but we were also told that we would expect to try to achieve annual economic growth because of this tax cut bill by 4% annually. Is there any evidence that we're close to that or within the foreseeable future can achieve that?
So we don't see that happening. In our projection, GDP growth goes down. I should say our GDP projection is well within the range of other forecasters.
Yeah.
The blue chip economic forecast surveys 40 or 50 leading economic forecasters,
Yeah.
and none see growth rising above 2.5%.
Okay, so the 4% annual economic growth is not achievable within the foreseeable future.
We don't see that happening, and our forecast, I think, is pretty mainstream.
Okay, so the deficit projected for this year is $1 trillion. That's right. Okay. And we are anticipating annual budgetary deficits, not the debt, to increase $1 trillion each year into the foreseeable future.
That's right. So it's 1.1 trillion this year and rising over the decade.
Okay, how much has the federal debt increased in the last 3 years?
In the last
3 years.
in the last 3 years, I don't have the dollar figure.
It's $3 trillion.
It's $3 trillion.
$3 trillion.
We've had close to.
Yeah, I'm just, here's my point. Here's my point. When you divert nearly $2 trillion since 2003 to a foreign war that took out a bad Sunni by the name of Saddam Hussein and put in a bad Shia by the name of Nouri al-Maliki, who the United States gave him his first term, Iran gave him his second term. And today, after losing 4,500 American soldiers and spending almost $2 trillion, Iraq is owned today by Iran. That's bad on its face. But in terms of the money that was diverted that otherwise could have been spent in the growth of the American economy, we have lost considerably. And I think, you know, when you look at deficit spending, a war obviously is not a good investment, nor are tax cuts, because tax cuts don't pay for themselves. Best case scenario, you can retrieve about 32 cents for every dollar that you give away in a tax cut. If you invest in education, you grow your economy, like China has done. If you invest in infrastructure, you grow your economy, like China has done. And if you invest in scientific research, you don't get beat by China when it comes to new technology like 5G, next generation. We're getting clobbered right now, and I would argue it's because we failed to invest in the right things toward the growth of the American economy. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As both you and our Republican lead here on the committee, Mr. Womack, have pointed out, yesterday the Congressional Budget Office released its most recent baseline, which reaffirmed what we already know. And some of what I'm going to say is going to be repetitive because I don't think we can say it loudly enough nor often enough. The economy is strong. The federal deficit continues to grow at an unsustainable rate, and mandatory spending is out of control. And I want to make sure that the record is straight and clear. Under the previous administration, the national debt doubled in 10 years. 8 years. I'm sorry, 8 years of the last administration. And much of the increase in mandatory spending that's out of control today is laws that went on the books and spending that went on the books, checks that we can't cash in the previous administration. In fiscal year 2020, CBO expects the deficit will be $1.015 trillion, making fiscal year 2020 the first year since 2012 that the deficit will eclipse $1 trillion. Additionally, CBO estimates that the debt held by the public will reach $17.9 trillion at the end of fiscal year 2020. That's 81% of GDP. And as our Republican lead, Mr. Womack, has pointed out, the outlook for mandatory spending is even more worrisome. This spending category currently accounts for 70% of the federal budget and is on track to reach 76% by 2030. There is no question that mandatory spending is the primary driver of our deficit. And yet, congressional Democrats have introduced legislation and proposals like the Green New Deal or Medicare for All that would add trillions of dollars in additional mandatory spending. Ladies and gentlemen, now is the time for Congress to address our out-of-control mandatory spending and take action to put the federal budget on a sustainable course. And I would recommend we start in this very committee by doing a budget resolution. Dr. Swagel, how relevant is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act to the fiscal imbalance? More specifically, where would our fiscal deficit be had we not passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act?
So this is in April 2018. CBO did a comprehensive analysis of the December 2017 tax cut. And we see that as adding about 1 percentage point of GDP to the deficit. So we cut taxes, lost revenue, increased growth that brought back some revenue, paid for roughly 20% of itself. So it's at 1 percentage point of GDP out of the 4.6% deficit that we see this year. So in some sense, that gives you a sense of the effect of the 2017 tax cut relative to the overall.
Is it safe to say that without the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we would still be facing massive deficits over the next 10 years?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Well, Dr. Swagel, the United States economy is undergoing the longest economic expansion in American history. What impact has the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act had on our economy, especially when American families are keeping more of their hard-earned money as a result of the legislation?
So in that April 2018 analysis, we saw the December 2017 Tax Act affecting business investment and consumer spending. So supporting higher consumer spending, as you said, families keeping more of their money, and then especially in business investment, the lower taxes on businesses would spur investment. And we saw what looked to be the response in the first half of 2018. Business investment was relatively strong. It's been difficult since then, in some sense, to disentangle the effects of the Tax Act from subsequent developments. Tariff policy in particular, starting around the middle of 2018, looks to have an effect on business investment. So it's a little hard to say exactly, what's the Tax Act, what's other things, but that's how we saw it, both supporting consumer spending and business investment. Okay.
Well, CBO projects that mandatory outlays for major healthcare programs will total $1.3 trillion in FY 2020 and almost double to $2.5 trillion by 2030. What are the greatest factors contributing to this massive growth in federal health spending?
So it's roughly divided in two. So half of it is just the aging of the population. We know an older population involves more health spending. And then the other half is the excess cost growth in healthcare. That healthcare costs are just rising faster than the overall economy, and that's driving the higher spending as well.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director. Well, here we are in the 4th year of the reign of the king of debt, self-styled. We now face more than $1 trillion deficit this year, and according to your report, $1 trillion deficits for as far as the eye can see in what you have described, as I understand it, a totally unsustainable path. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
And I guess the one thing we can be in complete agreement on from what you just said is that those Republican tax cuts that we were told were going to pay for themselves have not paid for themselves, have they?
We don't see the tax cut as...
Yes, sir. I believe you just said we think that it's, from your analysis, your objective analysis, that we got about 20 cents on the dollar for every dollar of tax cuts. Is that right?
That's correct, sir.
Yes, sir. That's consistent with what all economists, except for the true ideologues, told us before this proposal was ever adopted. And if we have more of those same unpaid Republican tax cuts, which President Trump seems to feel he has to promote in order to get reelected, it will make it even more unsustainable, won't it? If you have more tax cuts than...
I'm sorry. That's right.
Yes.
It just is unsustainable. More tax cuts.
And we were also, the Republicans had the help of that great historic character, Rosie Scenario, in their work on this. They told us that at a minimum, with this wonderful proposal, we'd have 3% growth. I heard President Trump say, why not 6% growth? You're just not being optimistic enough, but you have analyzed it, and what we can look forward to is less than, or about half of what Republicans told us we get. Only 1.7% growth is your best analysis. Is that right?
That's right, over the long term.
Over the long term. And so the same people that told us, oh, we can't afford more medical research, we can't afford better schools, we can't provide health care for more Americans, we can't meet our infrastructure needs with our crumbling roads. When it came to helping the very rich in this country and multinational corporations, they could not do enough. And I want to ask you about one specific area that I've been troubled with, was troubled when they hoisted it off on us, and that is all the giveaways to the multinational corporations to just encourage them to move more jobs offshore and to have new investment offshore. You're familiar with the very appropriately named GILTI provision in the Republican tax bill, aren't you? Are you not?
Yes, I am.
And as I understand it, that gives a 50% deduction for profits that multinationals earn overseas. And as if that half-off deal, a 50% sale that slashed the already very low corporate tax rate wasn't enough, up to a 10% rate of a return on tangible investments for multinationals overseas would be exempt entirely from GILTI, allowing a corporation to avoid even the low discounted rate that Republicans established on offshore profits. And as far as tangible investments are concerned, isn't this when a corporation decides they'd rather build their plant and get their equipment in some other country than in America? In other words, not putting America first.
There's a tangible investment would be a factory or plant, as you.
So last year, you came to us with your report and noted that the Republican tax bill contained provisions like GILTI that could be, quote, could have an incentive effect to encourage the location of such assets abroad instead of making America first. Isn't that right? That was in your report.
So the report talks about the overall impact of the 2017 Tax Act as improving incentives to invest in the U.S. That particular provision, as you said,
these international provisions to encourage abroad and more.
The tangible.
And as if the provisions that these Republicans wrote weren't bad enough in incentivizing moving offshore, the Treasury Department's been working to make it a little worse. And I read your report this year to indicate that among the factors you look at are the regulations Treasury has written and those that have not yet gone into effect. And you say they add about another $110 billion to us over the next decade. Is that right?
Yes. So we've been tracking the incoming data related to the 2017 Tax Act. We don't have all of it, just
because it probably will be worse once they actually complete their work. We don't have all of them in effect. We only have part of them in effect. GILTI not completely in effect. Likewise, the high tax exclusion, BEAT, another appropriately named provision in effect. My concern, Mr. Chairman, is that 90 corporate giants in this country paid zero, absolutely nothing, zilch, to contribute to the challenges that we face, and the Trump Treasury Department is only making it worse with their regulations. And thank you, Mr. Director and Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Stewart, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Director, thank you for being here. I'm going to ask you a question. I don't know if you're going to have the answer to it, but I think it would be appreciated. We're in a little bit of uncertainty with the coronavirus, obviously in China and spreading to other parts of the world, a little bit here in the U.S. It's clearly going to have an economic impact. Do you have any insights on that you could share with us?
Yes, of course. We've been tracking that, and we recognize that it will have economic impacts, as you say. We see them already with travel, certainly. We recognize that the manufacturing in China looks to be disrupted. It's hard, of course, to know how long that will persist and ultimately what will be the effects. CBO in the past has done work on similar instances. Back in the days of the avian flu, the CBO did analysis. I don't want to say, it's going to be the same this time as then, just because we don't ultimately know. But we are watching it closely, and we will provide information to the committee and to members as we have more.
Let me ask you this. Going back historically, looking at, as you mentioned, the avian flu or perhaps SARS, do we have an estimate of how much that impacted our economy at that time?
I don't recall offhand. The avian flu, in the end, it wasn't a gigantic impact in the U.S. It was more overseas, and then it was tamped down. And the same with SARS. It affected China and others. We do have some evidence from disruptions here. So it's not an epidemic, but say the catastrophes along the Gulf Coast from the hurricanes Katrina and Rita, had massive effects on the localities. In the grand scheme of the overall U.S. economy, it was a negative, and then we largely made it up. So, in some sense, it's a strength of the U.S. economy is our resilience, our flexibility, that we can bounce back these sorts of things.
Well, and let's hope, of course, that this doesn't turn into anything more serious than what we've seen so far. And this would be just one of the impacts, the economic impacts on people. And we're starting to see some of that already, which begs the point, and that is when we have these deficits like we do, we have very little or at least much smaller margin for error. Our tool chest is limited in the sense of how we can respond to some of these emergencies and respond to the economic impacts of them. Boring down on that just a little bit, 2020, $170 billion increase in revenue to the federal government, is that right?
I think that's right.
And do you have an estimate for 2021 increase in revenue?
An increase in revenue, sorry, I have it in front of me. I don't have 2021 in front of me, I apologize. But revenues will continue to grow. We see them, revenues growing at roughly a 4 to 5% pace.
Okay, that's a fairly remarkable statement. Revenue's growing at 4 to 5%. $170 billion this year, increase in revenue. And the point is that we don't have a revenue problem. We've got a deficit problem that's caused by spending. That's very, very clear. And the mandatory spending on this is, you know, the key to that. I mean, 70% of the federal deficit is attributable, the federal budget is attributable to mandatory spending. We all know that. And I just hope someone has the courage at some point to really take that on, because to date we haven't. But my question to you then is this. Anticipating by 2050, when we look at something like 180% of GDP in federal debt, much of that owned by not U.S. citizens, but by foreign entities and organizations and businesses. What does that mean? And what are the national security implications of having that much debt owned by foreign entities?
Okay, so I would first start where you started, that in a sense it reduces our fiscal room to maneuver. That if the debt is high, if in some sense investors' beliefs about the United States change and that leads to higher interest rates, well, the negative impact of higher interest rates on our fiscal situation will ramp up much more quickly. And in some sense that it could make policymakers hesitant to use fiscal policy as necessary, whether for national security purposes, for economic purposes, or anything.
Is it plausible to think that someone, I mean, we hear this scenario where a nation actually holds us hostage because of the debt that is owed to them. Is that a realistic or plausible, potential that could happen?
It's, in principle, it's possible. A challenge in some senses is the codependence, say, between us and China. China and Japan are the two largest holders of U.S. Debt. Japan's a touch above China now, but in some sense, China, if they were to try to hold us hostage, this sense in which we're in this together, that if they, did something that impaired U.S. Treasury bonds, they'd be taking a big hit as well. Yeah. So
yeah, it
could happen.
It is a two-way street. So, and that's actually the point I wanted to make. I mean, the idea of holding us hostage is probably exaggerated. The ability to influence our decisions and our policy, though, absolutely not. Would you agree?
That's
absolutely
right.
Not an exaggerated threat.
That's right. We increasingly depend on the rest of the world to finance our spending. Yeah. That's absolutely right.
Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Price, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our witness, and thank you for your good work and your testimony. We often hear contrary views about the deficit and the debt from our Republican friends and all around, I suppose. We've heard some of that this morning. We all remember Dick Cheney said, memorably, deficits don't matter. They seem especially not to matter when they're created by tax cuts for the wealthy or when they're created by defense spending. But then, on the other hand, we hear the sky's falling. The sky's falling. We can't go on like this. We've heard a lot of that this morning. So I hope you've already done some of this, and I hope you can continue to give us some perspective on this. Our deficit is now 4.6% of GDP. Our debt is 81% of GDP. Both are rising. They're high by historic standards, particularly in a time of economic growth and prosperity. They're getting higher. We don't seem to be able to envision a grand bargain such as we had back in the 90s because of, frankly, Republican dogmatism on taxes. Everything has to be on the table. And those budget deals of 1990, 1993, 1997, everything was on the table. There was a political price to be paid.
But nonetheless, I think a lot of us feel like those are some of the best votes we ever cast, where we had 4 years, not just of balanced budgets, but of paying off $400 billion of the national debt. Those seem to be out of reach now, those kinds of grand bargains. President Obama tried mightily, John Boehner too, but it just hasn't come together and doesn't seem likely to. So how should we look at this? What is sustainable? What would you say the economic consensus is as to what is sustainable? Is there a consensus? What would the range of that be? And then what should we aim for in terms of what's sometimes called fiscal space to anticipate what might happen in the economy, to undertake aggressive countercyclical measures in the event of a severe downturn? So I assume when we talk about what's sustainable, we're thinking about that as well as some abstract number that the economists might think represents a tipping point.
Okay. No, and in some you've put your finger on the key questions for looking at fiscal policy into the future. We know that markets today are not concerned, right? I mean, I've sat here and I've told you the fiscal situation is unsustainable, but interest rates remain low in the United States. The United States has the ability to undertake fiscal policy today, for whatever purpose, for stimulus, for infrastructure, for whatever the Congress decides to do. And so it's not that, in some sense, that's the difficulty, is that the challenge is not immediate, but as you said, we know it's rising, and the challenge is knowing, well, what's the end point, right? At what point is the debt level on the tipping point of not being sustainable? And there's not, unfortunately, there's not an answer in the economic literature. At one point, people said, oh, maybe it's like 70% debt to GDP. And of course, we see that, you see our numbers, and we are going above that without a problem. And so I don't know, that's the challenge. My last thought is the worry I have is that when we get there, when we reach the end of fiscal space, as you put it, it will happen quickly. And then market participants will lose their confidence in the US quickly, and sometimes it'll be too late. It'll be too late to address it without difficult changes.
Well, and that scenario you described could happen at the time of a severe downturn.
That's right.
We seem to be chugging right along, doing just fine, and then all of a sudden,
That's right.
it's not that we reached a tipping point, it's that we need substantial resources for a major countercyclical measures, whether they be on the tax side or on the spending side, and the resources simply aren't there without just an enormous increase in debt.
That's right. And we don't know, in the last crisis, 10 years ago, right, the US was able to fund, right, the ARA and TARP and all the, so all the crisis era programs without a problem. We saw with the China situation, US interest rates went down, right? So a problem in the rest of the world, people look at the US as safe. And, so we still have that status. The challenge is keeping it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, for 5 minutes.
Thank the chairman. Appreciate being here for testimony today. Couple of questions. Did this Democrat-led Congress pass a budget this last year?
A budget resolution,
Yeah.
a budget,
Budget
no,
resolution.
I don't believe so. No.
Okay. Has this Democrat-led Congress passed any reforms that will significantly reduce mandatory spending in the last year in this Congress?
No.
No. A lot of blame is being directed at the president. Where are spending bills? Where do they originate?
The spending
Do
bill.
they originate in the House of Representatives? Appropriations, spending bills? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's the right
Yeah.
tax and spending.
It's a Democrat-led
Congress.
House of Representatives, yeah. Did the House take up and pass the president's suggested spending levels? When the president sent over suggested spending levels, did this House take up those levels, or did they spend at a higher level?
I don't believe they spent, that the Congress spent at what the president sent over.
Right, I think they spent perhaps more than what the president suggested.
Yeah, I have to admit, I'm not up to date on the president's spending suggestions, but I suspect the answer is yes.
Did this Democrat-led Congress vote to raise the spending caps last July?
Yes, and our baseline reflects those higher spending caps.
Did this Democrat-led Congress vote for appropriations just this past December that will spend at those higher cap levels?
Yes, that's correct, and again,
Yes.
that's in our baseline.
Right. So it strikes me as interesting to hear a lot of finger pointing going at the president about the record debt levels and so forth over the last several years. And of course, the questions always go back to the tax cut of 2017. One of my colleagues has rightfully raised the questions here about the percentage. I've heard my colleague from Texas talking about getting 20 cents back on the dollar. One question I have for you is a practical matter. Are you all going to do another assessment of the 2017 tax bill from, you did one in the spring of 2018. Are you going to do an update or no?
We're not, we're tracking it, and the challenge is disentangling, what's the 2017
Other
act from
policies.
everything else since then. But we'll keep tracking as we can, for example, the international tax provisions, that we can track some of that.
Is it true that our federal receipts, revenue to the federal treasury since roughly World War II is tracked somewhere between sort of 14% to 20% on average?
That's right. The 50-year average is 17.4%
Right.
of GDP.
And it's ranged between those rough ranges, right? And we're somewhere in that kind of middle range, maybe just below 17 right now, like
We're a little bit
16s.
below that now, and we're going up in over the next decade. That we're going to have 17.4% revenue to GDP.
So we're tracking roughly at the same 15-year level of our overall revenues to the Treasury as a percentage of our GDP.
Of our economy, right?
Right.
In dollars, it's going up as the economy gets larger.
So it is safe to say that, without getting into the politics of it, that the main driver of our current imbalance is a massively growing amount of spending, and that that's obviously heavily tracking mandatory spending that's driving a lot of that, correct?
Right, and so there's the gap, right? Revenues at the 50-year is going to be at the 50-year historic level, and spending is higher, and that gap is the deficit.
So while we are looking at, and we can have debates about tax policy and the importance of tax policy for jobs and having money in the people's pockets and creating wealth and opportunity and stimulus versus what that may or may not mean for the net change to revenue and to the Treasury, and we can have that debate. The fact is, spending is being driven by mandatory spending. That's going to be 80% of the increase of our debt over the next decade is going to be Medicare, Social Security, and interest. Is that correct?
That's correct. Those three mainly.
And right now, this body, this committee, this House has got no proposals that it's putting forward to deal with those issues and solve those problems that we're dealing with. And one last question. When is Medicare Part A going to be insolvent?
It's in our projection is 2025.
And when is Social Security going to be insolvent?
Right. So we have the 2032 for
2032.
Social Security.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your time.
Okay, very good. And actually, I should just add, in our baseline, even when those trust funds become insolvent, we have in our baseline the spending continues because we're directed to do that by the budget law.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Chakowski, for 5 minutes.
Climate change, I see, is the greatest challenge facing humanity today. And across the globe, we see near-apocalyptic events like the continent-wide fires in Australia, flooding in Venice, and in the United States, we're seeing catastrophic flooding, severe storms, wildfires, and devastating drought. In Chicago, where I'm from, we've seen the lake at levels that we haven't seen before, threatening the shoreline across the area. And the Great Lakes generate $16 billion every year in tourism revenues. So the climate crisis could have disastrous economic effects. for our region and really for the country, if not the world, certainly the world. In 2019 alone, the United States was impacted by 14 separate billion-dollar disasters. If we do not take immediate action, the future economic and social costs of climate change will be breathtakingly high. And so I want to ask you, Director, and thank you for being here, how are these climate-related natural disasters and severe storms expected to affect the federal budget and economic outlook going forward, especially noting that we are predicting to see increased number of billion-dollar disasters in the near future?
It's an issue that we're looking at carefully, and in some sense on two levels. One is to say, what are the effects on the micro level in the economic baseline, in the fiscal baseline? So it's flood insurance program, military installations, and other things are affected. And so we're looking at that. Those are implicitly they're in our baseline, but we don't have a particular estimate of, flood insurance spending will go up by a certain amount because of climate, but we're working to understand that. The bigger challenge, as you say, is overall the macro picture, where we know that the climate change will have an effect on the overall economy and therefore on federal revenue and federal spending. And that we're also working to understand that. It might not show up in a big way, in the next year, even in the next 10 years, but we know as we look at a 30-year horizon, the overall U.S. economy will be affected.
I'm really shocked for you to say that it may not show up in the next decade, because it's showing up right now. Given our current economic conditions of persistently low interest rates and low inflation rates, would you agree that it is sound fiscal policy for the government to invest in a clean economy now?
Okay. So, and I should actually make clear, since the showing up is saying, will the level of GDP be different, and therefore the level of revenue is, of course, showing up as economic impacts. Just trying to trace them through precisely to the budget is.
And I would add, you could also talk to the farmers. We were over a month late getting into the field in Illinois. The economic impacts are so obvious.
And so it's an issue that, an area, in which the CBO did a lot of work back in, it was 2013, I think, when the Waxman-Markey legislation, the cap and trade legislation, was being debated. We haven't worked on that basically a lot since, and we're starting that up again, so we'll have more to say. On the investment part, I'm sorry, I didn't answer the second part of your question. That's something we're also, again, starting to look at, is to connect those policy levers to the economy and to the baseline.
Yeah, I would hope that CBO could actually help Congress analyze these situations and help us come up with long-term plans on how we deal with that. It's just surprising to me that while you're beginning to look at that and trying to understand that this is a major force in our country today that I think is changing the economics in so many ways.
That's right. And in some sense, we know that we need to do our work, so we're ready to support the Congress. And that's what we're doing. First, on the baseline, the usual, what does it mean for the budget? And then over the coming months to understand better how various policy levers will affect climate and then affect the economy and so on.
I think the question of what kind of investments are smart for our economy to make us more resilient, I think that you have a big role to play, and I hope you will, and I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Director Swagel. We really appreciate you being here. This hearing today is incredibly important. The testimony we're hearing today clearly lays out that one of our country's biggest challenges are growing deficits and growing debt are unsustainable. Our growing debt and deficit represent a huge tax and fiscal obligation for future generations. Those generations are going to face daunting challenges of lower economic growth opportunities and massive tax increases. The tragedy of today's hearings is that the majority of this committee and the House of Representatives have buried its head in the sand and is failing to govern by passing a budget to clearly share its priorities with the American people. Do they have a budget to address the country's fiscal challenges? No. Do they have a budget which shows the true cost of their socialist projects like the Green New Deal, Medicare for All, free college programs that will explode the deficits and debt by over $100 trillion? No. Do they have any kind of budget? No. Even worse, to deflect from their failure to govern by passing a budget, they try to blame deficits on pro-growth tax reforms that went into effect 2 years ago. The tax reform that's helping to grow our economy, the tax reform that has grown federal revenues to record levels, the tax reform that has created millions of jobs, the tax reform that has reduced unemployment, the tax reform that has lifted millions of families out of poverty, the tax reform that's helped grow incomes for lower-income American families by significantly higher rates than other income groups. So in light of this foggy rhetoric by the majority, it's important to address the issues that we face today. In order to do this, let's look at a few issues. So Director Swagel, I want to ask about what part that tax reform plays in federal debts and deficits. So what is the total amount of expected federal revenues over the next 10 years? $48 trillion?
That's right.
Okay. And what's the total revenue impact, based on CBO's estimates, of tax reform over the next 10 years? Is it $1.9 trillion?
That's right. The loss over 10 years is one.
And so a little simple math here shows that the percentage of tax reform impact compared to total revenues is 4%. That means 96% of federal revenues were unaffected. So tax reform is clearly not the big issue here. And so what are the projected deficits over the next 10 years? About $13.1 trillion, right? Yep. And so if you divide $13.1 trillion by $1.9 trillion, you see that the total impact of tax reform on the deficits over the next 10 years is about 14%. That means 86% of federal deficits is because of something else. And so let's look at this slide. This is CBO slide 7, and this shows that revenues are growing faster than the rate of the economy, correct? Okay, that's right. That's good. That means deficits should be reduced. If we go to the next slide, it shows that discretionary spending is growing at a rate slower than the rate of the economy, growth in the economy, right? And GDP? Right. Okay, that's good. Okay, this brings us to the key issue. The two areas that are growing faster than the rate of growth in the economy are mandatory expenditures and net interest. Now, so those are the issues that need to be addressed. So historically speaking, if revenues grow faster than the economy and expenditures grow slower than the rate of the economy, then our debts and deficits should be reduced, right?
That's right.
Okay. I'm saying this, I'm a CPA, a former chief financial officer, a former CEO, so I try to analyze this from a business perspective. So if we really want to get our arms around this, what's in the mandatory spending category that's blowing things up? Well, let me ask you one other question. So what are revenues in the last year of your projections, 2030? It's like $5.7 trillion, I think.
Yeah, it's, I'm sorry, I'm just going to look. It's as a percentage of GDP, it's...
No, just in dollars.
In dollars, it's 5.7.5 trillion.
Okay, and what are total mandatory expenditures in that same year?
It's about 4.9 trillion.
Okay, I was thinking it was 5.7, which leaves...
Yeah. Yep, mandatory is in 2030 is like 4.9 trillion.
Okay, and then when you add debt to it,
and then
net interest?
Right, net interest is another 800 billion.
Okay, so 5.7 trillion.
Exactly, yeah, between
okay, all right. I do study the numbers.
Yep.
So that means that mandatory expenditures and net interest on debt will absorb 100% of total revenues. That means there's no money left for anything else, for the FBI, for national security, for border security, for anything else, right? So really what this says is that we as Congress need to address the big issues here that nobody wants to address. And it's my hope that the majority will work with the minority, the Republicans, Democrats will sit down together, address these challenges head on so that we can balance the budget and take care of future generations. Thank you. I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Swagel, for being here. One area that I've been very interested in is understanding how investments or policy impacts the economy through the externalities that they generate. And obviously, in some cases, we measure that. In some cases, we don't. I'm not talking about those benefits that are promised, that are difficult to measure, or that some claim, like when in the case of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, are taking place, when we know that that particular policy is only returning 20 cents on the dollar of investment. That's something that both sides seem to readily acknowledge. Not good math, not supporting that policy at all. But specifically, I'd like to get your thoughts on the impact of another set of policies and the external benefits that would be derived, and that has to do with infrastructure spending. According to the Economic Policy Institute, the rate of return on infrastructure is tremendous. Lots and lots of economic studies have pointed this out. In 2010, you may be familiar with the work that Moody's Analytics did, looking at fiscal stimulus for a whole variety of governmental activities, tax cuts, increases in SNAP program spending, but specifically infrastructure, where their analysis determined that for every dollar of infrastructure investment, there's a return of $1.57 to the economy. It's a big difference between getting 20 cents back on the dollar and getting $1.57 back on the dollar. I know you may not specifically project or measure that, but it is your assessment that infrastructure spending would have a net positive impact on the economy and on our fiscal condition?
So certainly on the economy, infrastructure investment, if well done, has the ability to improve GDP and have the kind of positive external effects that you mentioned that would have feedback to the budget. You know, the challenge is the precise infrastructure that's done. I think we all know, right, there's, you know, the high-speed rail in the middle of nowhere, and there's the sort of, you know, fixing the bridge that's key.
Right, but if we're talking about the kind of investments that would clearly be tied to efficiencies in delivering products to market, particularly when we talk about supporting the American manufacturer in our very, you know, steep global competition that we're facing, understanding what our competitors are doing. China, for example, spending 10 times what we are as a percentage of GDP. It does seem to me to be not only good fiscal policy, but good policy in general for us to make these sorts of significant investments. And then we get the additional reward of significant return to the economy. Is that do you share that general view?
I do, and as you said, it's very important that there are going to be things that cost money but have a huge impact on the economy. And in some sense, you know, if it costs money, sometimes it's worth it. It's not the only standard.
Right. If I could just then return to a point that was made by one of my colleagues on the other side about this issue of our deficits and debt. The point was made that while 14% of projected deficits are attributable to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, in other words, that legislation made our situation worse. No question about that. The solution that's being suggested over and over again is to deal with so-called mandatory spending. What percentage of the mandatory spending is constituted of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, roughly? You don't have to give me precise.
It's by far the largest part.
Right.
I don't know,
so
but it's by far.
I think we need to be clear on what's being said. The discussion is, it's okay to give tax cuts to benefit the people at the very top, but you have to offset that by cutting Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. Because if the real interest is in reforming those programs, we're all ears. In fact, we have legislation. One of my colleagues said there's no plan from Democrats. We have a plan on Social Security with 208 Democratic sponsors that would deal with Social Security and make it stable as far as the eye could see. We invite our Republican colleagues to join us in that, and if they have suggestions on how we might improve that legislation, we're all ears. But to take the president's proposal to cut Medicare and the president's proposal to cut Social Security and call that reform by placing it on the backs of the people who can least afford it, but happily celebrate and throw parties and parades for tax policy that gave the wealthiest people in this country massive breaks at the cost of everyone else, and then say, well, it only added to 14% of our fiscal problem, is not a very good argument. So I appreciate your time here. I've gone over time, and I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, can I revise
Please respond, sure.
one sentence? I'm not responding. It's just when I referred to high-speed rail, I realized saying in the middle of nowhere is a poor way of putting it. And so I really had in mind investment projects that have a low return and not trying to say a bad thing about any particular part of the country.
All right, thank you for that clarification. Now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When I flee to the family farm, it is in the middle of nowhere, and I go for precisely that reason. So I took no offense to that. I don't want high-speed rail in my backyard there. I'm listening to the finger pointing, going back and forth. I want to confess, I've been here 9 years. A lot of this is my fault. And I appreciate the work CBO has done during that time. To work with such great men and women on both sides of the aisle and having not been able to make more of an impact is incredibly disappointing to me. But there was a time when we passed that 74 Budget Act and constituted this committee that we said we're tired of taking orders from the White House, we're tired of OMB running the show, and we need to create an institution that will put us on equal footing. And what has transpired over those past 40 years is we've dwarfed OMB, and there's not a president of either administration that isn't playing with the OMB numbers, and America looks to you all as the fair arbiter in that space. I thank you for taking on that responsibility. I want to look up here at your slide. Tell me what is reflected there in 2009, 2010 in that giant spike in mandatory spending as a percent of GDP?
So it was both. Of course, GDP was going down because we were in a recession, and then there's a variety of mandatory expenditures that went up, increased transfers and other things, and the Affordable Care Act has created a new category of mandatory spending.
And so as the economy has not just recovered, but begun to expand, I would expect to see all of the crisis response go away and, in fact, begin to trend the other direction. I don't see that. I see a systemic increase of several percentage points there. Is that the Affordable Care Act in its entirety? Am I looking at something else there?
No, it's not. I mean, the increase in mandatory spending, the higher level, it's a mix of the new legislation and then the trend of the two trends I mentioned, the aging and the excess cost growth in healthcare. So it's a mix of those.
Mr. Kildee was talking about investment in transportation. I appreciate your distinction between investment and smart investment. If I could get more projects out the door faster, we could seek those benefits and find them faster. He mentioned the figure of about $1.50 for every dollar invested. You're projecting trillion-dollar deficits. If I then find $2 trillion in new revenue, would you, and we spend it all in a new transportation project, would you expect us then to be able to have a zero deficit that following year because that $2 trillion would yield the additional trillion that we needed?
No, I wouldn't expect that. In some sense, right, that would be like a pay-go. There might be some benefit, but it wouldn't reduce the existing deficit.
So let's look at the trend lines there with discretionary and net interest. It looks like what you're suggesting is we argue so much about how to invest in schools and how to invest in roads and how to invest in basic science. It looks like you're saying because of the debts that we have incurred on both sides of the aisle, that we are going to be spending almost half as much paying our creditors as we spend on all investment in America combined?
That's right. The discretionary spending includes essentially all federal investment.
Have any members of Congress come to you in your capacity as our budget analyst to say, I'm excited about this figure, and how can we make sure that net interest payments rise even higher to replace, crowd out what would have been investment?
No, sir.
I'm looking at Politico. They keep track of the presidential candidates. I was disappointed in the Republicans last cycle because no one campaigned on balancing the budget. They say of the 27 Democratic members who have been in the presidential election mix so far, including past and former members of this committee, absolutely none has taken a position on debt. That of all the questions asked, we're not talking about debt. here you are looking at this. I would have a tough time getting out of bed every morning if I had your job because there is doom and gloom out there on the horizon. Not that we can't solve problems, but that for whatever reason we haven't been able to come together to do that in quite some time. What is it that you see as a professional economic analyst that I need to see to help me understand why this isn't captivating the American people in a way that pushes the key leaders on both sides of the aisle to not only not to address it, but to completely ignore it in our campaign seasons?
So I look at the vertical dashed line of today and then look at the net interest. And sometimes that's the challenge, is interest rates are low and interest rates have remained low, and the cost of financing our debt has been modest, even as our debt has increased. And that's the challenge, is getting a start on addressing the situation over time. Doesn't have to be done the second, it's not emergency, but it's a long-term challenge, and that's the challenge of starting.
We're only one major crisis away then, Mr. Chairman, from getting our presidential candidates and presidents to focus on this issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. And now recognize the Vice Chairman of the committee, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I also want to thank my colleague, Mr. Woodall, because I'd like to pick up exactly where you left off, because I do care about the debt. Director Swiggle, do you care about the debt?
I do, yes.
It sounds like Mr. Woodall cares about the debt as well. And so if you get a chance to see the president, you can tell him that at least the three of us provide an answer to his question that he asked recently at a private fundraiser, where he said, "Who the hell cares about the debt?" It's good to know there are at least three of us in answer to the president's question. As a candidate, President Trump said that he could eliminate the national debt quickly. Of course, as president, he's added $3 trillion to the debt during his first 3 years in office. So are we on track to eliminate the national debt?
No, we're not.
Despite the president's claims as a candidate, you stated that, and I quote, "Not since World War II has the country seen deficits during times of low employment that are as large as those that we project, nor in the past century has it experienced large deficits for as long as we project," end quote. What single law signed by President Trump is the single largest contributor to the deficit and debt growth over a 10-year period?
Well, that would be the December 2017 Tax Act.
The Tax Cut and Jobs Act, in other words, as the president refers to it. So I'd like to now shift, taking that line of questioning, and move over to where Mr. Price left off, because he talked about what happens when the debt to GDP ratio gets to a point where it's unsustainable. And you said that there will be a tipping point where that happens, though it's hard to predict exactly where that tipping point is. You then said that the effects will be felt very quickly. Mr. Director, what are those effects? What sort of effects could we expect to see?
So when we reach that point, we would, if the fiscal crisis happens, it would come about as investors lose faith in the willingness or ability of the United States to repay our debt without giving rise to high inflation, right? We borrow in dollars, so of course we can always print more dollars. That would lead to inflation and so on. So we'd have higher interest rates, higher inflation. The higher interest rates and inflation would lead to negative impacts on consumer spending, business investment, and therefore the overall economy.
And so would we likely see a major recession? I mean, how would this play out in the lives of ordinary Americans?
That's right. It would has the potential to be a severe negative economic impact, with job creation slowing or going negative, output slowing or going negative. And again, that's not in our projection. And I'm not saying that's happening within 10 years or even in 30 years. It's just that the potential is there with our rising debt.
But as Mr. Woodall said, it's that crisis that we might have to reach before more people, other than the three of us in America, apparently care about the debt, to answer the president's question.
And so that's the challenge for policymakers is starting and simply taking the first step. That's right.
And if since we don't know when this tipping point would occur, I mean, if it were to happen soon, do we have a lot of space in fiscal or monetary policy to react quickly and to avert a crisis?
that's where we look at financial markets today, and we see interest rates are low, and that's in our baseline. We've marked down our interest rate projection. That suggests we do have the space today. If there's some problem today, whether it's economic or national security, we have the fiscal ability if the Congress chooses to respond.
And how should the Congress respond in the event of such a crisis?
Of course, you won't get policy suggestions from CBO, but you will get an analysis. So if there's an economic crisis and you tell us to analyze, this spending or this tax cut or whatever, we will give you our best analysis.
In your best analysis, has creating such large debt during a time of low unemployment been good policy?
It's the noteworthy thing about the economic and budget situation today is that the deficit is wide and the debt is rising when the economy is as strong. And so it's unusual, and so it makes the challenge we face yet larger.
Would you say that unusual is a euphemism for bad?
I was thinking of President Kennedy.
Perhaps terrible?
Right, I was thinking of President Kennedy, his inaugural address, right, was fix the roof while the sun is shining. In a sense, that's the challenge, is to figure out how to do that on the fiscal side.
And that's obviously what we're failing to do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Burchett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. I won't bore you with questions that have already been asked, so I'll try to put it down a little bit on my level so that at least I'll understand your answer. And I appreciate you, brother. Appreciate you being here. Your report stated that the deficit had reached $1 trillion, and that debt is held by the public, and it's risen to 81% of the GDP. That number, as you reported, is projected to rise to 98% by 2030 and by 180% by 2050. I think that's ridiculous. It's clear to me that we lack discipline when it comes to responsibly spending hard-earned taxpayer dollars. I hate it when either side tries to belittle small business or anything else and tells them how they need to better manage their money when we make drunken sailors look good. I know Crenshaw's a sailor, but he's not a drunk, so I can say that beside him. But Dr. Swagel, how can Congress scale back our irresponsible spending habit without having a devastating effect on the economy?
In a sense, the fiscal space that several of your colleagues have discussed means that we have the ability to do this over time, right? There doesn't have to be a wrenching change in, whether on the spending side or on the revenue side, that we can address this over time. And in a sense, the sooner we act as a nation, again, it doesn't have to be tomorrow, but the sooner we act, the more manageable will be the changes and the less the disruption to our economy and to small businesses and others, as you say.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll yield back the rest of my time, and I won't bother you with running down my friends across the aisle or any of my predecessors, so I'll just leave it at that. I'll save that for another day.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Panetta, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Womack, and thank you, Director, for being here, and thank you for your service. And I guess thank you for giving us this report, this information, which is actually a pretty stark warning. A warning that, as you've said, deficits are pretty much growing beyond our control. But what puts the fear in me is that deficits are growing beyond our will to control it. It's almost like we've gotten to a point where we've given up. It's what it feels like. And that's why we're returning to trillion-dollar deficits for the first time since 2012. Our national debt is expected to surpass $31 million by the end of 2030. And the debt service will take up a larger share of the federal spending, leaving less for everything else that we've talked about. And of course, it's going to lead to higher risks of fiscal crises, and hamper our ability to respond to those types of crises. Yet, we're hearing a range of perspectives on our debt and deficits, that we're in a debt emergency and we have to dramatically cut spending today, or that it's a long-term issue and really not something we need to deal with right now. I don't agree with either of those. I do agree with the fact that we need to start developing a plan to combat long-term deficit growth. Because I think as we're seeing, the truth is that neither party, Democrats or Republicans, are doing anything right now to get our fiscal house in order, unfortunately. Doesn't mean we have to forego important investments, okay? We understand that. We don't have to forego infrastructure, our students, our families. But it's clear that our debt will make it harder to continue making these types of worthy investments. And it means that we will need to be fiscally responsible when it comes to our spending, and yes, raise the revenue to do it. It means that we will need a plan to control healthcare costs and prescription drug prices. We will need legislation like the Social Security Act, Social Security 2100 Act, and restore solvency to our Social Security trust funds. And yes, we will need to repeal provisions of the 2017 tax law, which are contributing to our current deficit without providing the growth needed to offset it, and ensure that the wealthy are paying their fair share. And I appreciate what Professor Price said, that everything does need to be on the table when addressing this issue when it comes to our deficit. And that includes us, this committee, putting things on the table. It includes this committee having a role to play. And I do believe that this committee can begin by getting back to passing budget resolutions and discussing ways to reform the budget process. I'm hopeful that we in this committee will take a serious look, not just at the drivers of the deficit, but also explore ways to ensure a fiscally sound policy in the future. Now, that being said, Director, what do you feel this committee can do to reduce future deficit spending?
And of course, I have to start by saying, right, we'll support you, we'll give you the analysis, we won't give you the policies. But you've put your finger on the challenge. And can I just add one, small dimension to it, which in a sense, imagine a policy of pay-go, right, which would be a step, in the direction of fiscal responsibility, but there's also a sense in which by taking off pay-fors, by taking them off the table and spending them, well, that doesn't address the existing challenge, and in some ways makes it more difficult because then other things have to be done, whether spending or revenue, to address the challenge. And sometimes that's how difficult it is, that pay-go is not enough, and in some ways it makes it more difficult, again, without evaluating the merits or demerits of any particular project.
Understood. Would, in your analysis, so I'll make it easier for you to answer it, in your analysis, would this committee passing a budget resolution or trying to reform the budget process, would that help?
I mean, that wouldn't show up directly in the baseline, and of course that would change the way we work, and we would work however the Congress directs us to.
On that note, what do you think of biennial budgeting to reduce deficits? I mean, or biennial appropriating?
Right. So I have not looked at that. We haven't looked at it since I've been director. I recognize in some of the advantages and disadvantages of sort of giving the Congress more time and space to in some sense think further down the road. And of course the disadvantages of less control in a sense.
Understood. Thank you. I appreciate your service, and thanks again, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Hearn, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. Director, thank you for being here. I want to give you a shout out for you and your team and the work you do to produce tools that we can do our work better. I would encourage all of my colleagues to go review your website. You have a tremendous amount of information on there. I spent some late nights reading a lot of your outlooks, not yours personally, but your group from all the way back in 2000. So it's interesting to see the predictions over the various policies. It's interesting that we take in $3.6 trillion, which is the highest we've ever taken in as a country, and we still can't seem to get our budgets balanced. Most American people, if not all, find that just impossible to even comprehend. We do have a problem that we need to get after. It's kind of run amok, if you will. It's when you look at that China and Japan own probably more than half of our foreign debt between the two of them, and it kind of vacillates back and forth between where they're at. One likes us, the other not so much, and it's very troubling. I go back and remember in July 17, when General Mad Dog Mattis testified before Congress,
He said the national debt is the biggest national security threat we must face. As President Eisenhower noted, the foundation of military strength is their economic strength. In 4 short years, however, we'll be paying more on interest on our debt than will be bigger bill than we pay for our national defense. Much of that interest will be money that is destined to leave America for overseas. If we refuse to reduce our debt or pay down our deficit, what is the impact of the national security of future generations who will inherit their irresponsible debt and taxes to service it? No nation in history has maintained its military power if it failed to keep its fiscal house in order. So this is not a Republican issue. This is not a Democrat issue. This is a national security issue. We must come together to mitigate this threat. Many would say that we've created the greatest Ponzi scheme by taking economic opportunity away from future generations to pay for our insatiable appetite to spend today. Director Swagel, would you agree that this is could become a national security threat if we don't get this house in order?
Yes, sir, I agree, and agree with General Mattis. And we saw that in the chart that was put up before, that in some sense says discretionary spending, it doesn't have to be squeezed, but as revenue essentially equals mandatory and net interest payments, discretionary inevitably will be squeezed.
So Director Swagel, in your analysis, would you agree that Republicans and Democrats are responsible for this? I mean, if you go back to President Bush, he doubled the debt from 5 to 10 trillion, Obama from 10 to 20 trillion. Certainly President Trump's on a pathway to double it from 20 to 40 trillion. But we have equal responsibility, and there's a lot of politics that come into the budget process, which it shouldn't. This is a numbers game, right? I mean, it's really about balancing our budget, revenues, expenses not exceeding revenues, and getting after it. We saw it can be done back in 97, 8, 9, 2000. American citizens look at us as failing to do our basic job of creating a budget and living within our means. Nobody understands. It's one of the highest percentage in surveys that are done. Why can't you do your job? Mr. Swagel, you're a student of your job. Could you describe to us the purpose of the Congressional Budget Act of 1974?
It was referred to earlier, in some sense, to give the Congress the tools and the information that the executive had already with OMB. And so that is our job, first and foremost, is to provide the Congress with support on the budget and the numbers and the analysis. So you have the report we did today that gives you that information, and then when there's legislation, we will work and do our best to provide the Congress with cost estimates.
Director, I'm sorry, I'm just running out of time. But it also laid out a format by which we would get the President's budget, the House and the Senate's budget, we'd reconcile the budgets, and the President's is really pretty much a policy guideline. It wasn't legislative edict. And that we would create a budget, we'd authorize the monies, 302s and 302Bs and all these things, and we would have a budget produced so that we knew what our spending was going to be on October 1. Is that correct?
That's correct.
How many times has that been done since 1974?
Boy.
Let me help you. 4 times.
4 times,
You know when the last time it was done?
I don't know.
1996. So the Congress has failed, this committee has failed to do its job and get, the House on both sides of the aisle have failed to get that done in the last 24 years. 24 years, we have not done our job. So we have to come together to get a budget. There's nobody in this room personally, or if you're a business person that runs a business or your personal life without a budget. And we shouldn't come in here and be political and not get that done as well. Again, I applaud you for the work you do and staying out of the policy world. But we need to collectively come and do our job. This is not the President's fault. It's not the Senate's fault. We have to originate a budget out of here, and we have to come together, get the leaders of our respective houses when we're in the majority, get that done. So, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate it. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, it's not equal blame. We have a chart that is coming up that just reminds people it's all the House's fault. No, before you can spend, you have to pass the House and the Senate and be signed by the President. The President has outsized power in this, and we'll notice that from Nixon and Ford all the way through President Trump, every Republican president has come in and made the budget deficit worse. And since Carter, every Democratic president has come in and made the deficit position better, without exception. The next chart shows that the $1.5 trillion tax cut plus interest brings it up to closer to $2 trillion. When President Obama's economic plan was passed, it was at the top of the unemployment, and you can see that it reduced the unemployment rate. And when a plan twice as big came in, you don't see a wrinkle in the trend line. The next is in the jobs. We'll notice, this is in October, the last 33 months of the Trump administration, first 33 months, 189,000 jobs a month, 224,000 jobs under Obama. Again, not a wrinkle. In terms of the economy by the Dow has gone up significantly more under Obama than under Trump. And Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent to introduce into the record an article in Fortune magazine entitled, "The S&P 500 is at an all-time high, but markets still performed far better under Obama than Trump."
That objection so ordered.
Thank you. Mr. Swagel, we've heard a lot of comment about bills that have been introduced on the Democratic side without a comment that under the Democratic protocol, anything would have to be paid for before it got passed. Let me talk about an unpaid-for tax cut that actually passed under the Republicans. You mentioned that there were investment of the benefits of that tax cut, where 80% of the benefits went to the top 1% in corporations. How much of those benefits to corporations were invested in stock buybacks and dividends compared to increased jobs and higher salaries?
So we don't have a precise parsing of what went into, as you said, buybacks and investment. We do see an investment response, but we can't divvy that up.
Isn't it true that a substantial portion went to stock buybacks and dividends?
So we have tracked that corporations have returned capital to their shareholders, including through stock buybacks.
Okay, and that's not like more jobs and higher salaries. And can you comment on the projected interest we're going to be paying in 2030 at the rate we're going compared to discretionary spending?
And we saw that on the chart that the net interest at the end of our budget window will be nearly half of discretionary spending.
That would be more than non-defense discretionary spending?
It would be certainly more than non-defense discretionary spending, that's right.
And at the end of in 2001, there was a projection, you weren't here then, but when President Clinton left office, we were supposed to pay off the entire debt held by the public by 2008, is that right?
Yes, I do. I wasn't here, but I do remember that.
Which means that we would be paying zero interest, not more than the entire non-defense discretionary spending.
That's right. And of course, there's the recession and subsequent legislation that have changed that.
Well, yeah, we messed it up because we passed 2 tax cuts without paying for it, prescriptive drug benefit without paying for it, fought 2 wars without paying for it, and all of a sudden, guess what? We're back in the ditch. None of that paid for under the Democratic leadership. We had PAYGO. If you want a new plan, you got to pay for it. Can you say a word about what income inequality does to our budget, to your budget projections?
So income inequality is part of our budget. It affects both spending and revenue, and so rising inequality in some sense affects what's happening at the bottom of the distribution with more entitlement spending, and that flows through into the fiscal situation. It poses a challenge for the long-term budget, that we know that increasing inequality has particular effects on families, on children, and in some sense on the intergenerational transmission of poverty to the future, which again feeds back to the economy. So in some sense, I'm sorry, I'll bring this together. There's both the immediate impacts on the spending programs from inequality, and then I have in mind the longer term impacts on what does it mean for us as a nation and our growth trajectory.
And the more inequality, the worse it is for the budget?
That is a good question. I don't know, actually, because
that's what you just said. I mean,
the challenge is that because of the progressive nature of our tax system, that income at the top is taxed by more than income at the bottom. So I can't in my head say offhand. So that's why I'm not sure But I know it's an economic challenge, even if I can't parse out the fiscal impact right away.
A gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Musser, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Swagel, do you agree our labor market is strong, our unemployment rate is at historic lows of 3.5%, wages are rising? Despite this extremely robust economy, our country is still on a very concerning financial path due to excessive spending habits?
Yes, so as you said, the economy has pretty good growth, and the unemployment rate is low, and the labor market is strong with rising wages throughout the distribution, and especially strong wage growth at the bottom of the distribution, and as we said before, the deficit remains wide, even as the economy looks to be in pretty good shape.
Revenues are up 5% in 2019, projected the same in 2020. Spending is up quite a bit more in 2019 and projected for 2020. Spending is dramatically projected to increase over the next 10 years. But revenues are up 5%. I was the former revenue secretary for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The best growth year in revenues we ever had was 2.9%. We ended up having quite a surplus without tax increases. So a 5% increase in revenues after the Trump Jobs Act and tax cuts is still a very healthy revenue growth rate, would you say? Compared to other countries?
It's a good question. I don't know about compared to other countries, but it's, I mean, revenues are growing, as you said, by 5%, and at the end of our projection, we're going to be right back to the historical average for revenues as a share of GDP.
So I'm going to continue. The federal budget cumulative deficit is projected, as you have said, at $1 trillion in 2020. That's an increase of $31 billion from 19 to 20. It is not an increase from year to year of $1 trillion, as some people try to make it out or maybe misunderstand. Now, let's just compare to the Obama administration, strictly for the purpose of comparing. Revenues in, let's use 2015, the heyday when the Obama economy was at its best. Revenues were at 5% growth, same as they are now. That's after the Obama tax increases. They were at 5% growth. Mandatory spending, however, that year did go up $200 billion, $200 billion year to year. That's more than this year. And discretionary was flat, largely due to the sequestership and some can claim the good work of the Republican Congress. So the point is, we have, without casting blame, we have a mandatory spending problem, and trying to place blame on a tax cut, okay, is truly intellectual dishonesty. Would you agree?
And so the way that I would analyze it is to say this year, you know, what's the tax cut as a share of GDP? 1.2%, just for this year. It's 1% over 10 years, but it's just this year, say 1.2, and the deficit we project this year is 4.6. So that's this year, as you're focusing, 1.2 percentage points out of 4.6 would be the part I would allocate to the December 2017 Tax Act.
But we've created millions of jobs, 7.3 million over the last 3 years. If you factor in approximately a $9,000 at an average family tax rate, federal revenue, that's $63 billion right there. Add in what the savings is from entitlements, that's well over $100 billion. And it is impossible, let's face it, it's impossible to measure for instance, the small business tax cut, where you give approximately a 20% tax rate cut to a small business who then adds an employee and then continues compound the following year because his business is increasing. And then with trade agreements, they're actually picking up added market share in other nations and in other states and throughout the world over a 5-year period. How can that new revenue that comes in be calculated? Right? I mean, that's what has put America on the fast track from 1945 to 1990 versus Europe, for instance. We grew our economy 40% plus where the European economies were because we were in a more of a competitive, we created a more competitive environment for our businesses. Even though we reduced our corporate tax rates to 21%, Ireland is far less than us, 12.5%. The UK is at 19%. Wouldn't you agree that competitive tax rates are essential to the long-term growth of our economy, and we owe it to the people of America not to accumulate their money, those tax dollars, but provide it back to them so they can spend it rather than the federal government spend it for them? And we should, at the same time, focus on more fiscal responsibility when it comes to spending?
Okay. Our analysis of the December 2017 Tax Act looked at the effect on the attractiveness of the U.S. for global investment, the competitiveness. And our analysis said that the overall Tax Act, including all the international provisions and the domestic, the lower corporate rate, made the United States a more attractive place for global investment. So that is based on our analysis. That's what I would,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My apologies for going over my time.
All right, gentleman's time has expired. And now recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Lee, for
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me say this first of all. I'm glad you're here, and in looking at a lot of the economic data, you lay out the numbers and the projections, but I don't see any much reference to the issue of race and gender. And the data is not disaggregated at all. And so I'm trying to unpeel this onion a little bit as it relates to communities of color, African American, Latino, and Asian Pacific American and Native communities. Because it's no secret that economic inequality disproportionately impacts women and communities of color. But I can't find any of the data in here as to the impact. So we have a couple of numbers and references I'd like to ask you about. Latino, Black, and Indigenous households, they each make $20,000 less than white households. Women bring home about $200 less a week than men. So I'm not sure if you've done any economic outlook surveys, assessments, data collection that will impact to tell us how the economic outlook really addresses income inequality for women and communities of color specifically, and what the economic case for reducing high levels of inequality for specific populations, what that looks like. Secondly, this CBO report that was issued last month, it projected that income inequality will be greater in 2021 than it was in 2016. And it shows that federal tax and transfer policies will be less effective in reducing inequality in 2021 than 5 years before. And so I'm wondering how the 2017 tax law plays a role in that. And then the final question, again related to these two, is that the economic, unemployment forecast. First of all, the unemployment rate for African Americans still is double that of our white counterparts. And so how do you lay that out in terms of what that means as it relates to wage growth?
Okay, no, good.
Going forward, and how you close that gap.
Okay.
Because I know this unemployment rate also reflects, even though it's double that of our white counterparts, people of color, African Americans, are working 2 and 3 and 4 jobs just to be able to barely survive. Mm-hmm. And I don't see any of this noted in any of these reports that you issued.
Okay, no, very good. I'll say a few words on a couple of these topics. And in some sense, you've put your finger on this report, that this is CBO with our budget blinders on, and we focus, as you said, very narrowly. And I am the first to say that the budget's important. That's what we're here to support the committee and the Congress. But by far, it doesn't address every important issue facing the nation and the Congress, by far. So I'm the first to agree with you. On income distribution, we have done important work at the Congressional Budget Office. You mentioned the report looking at the change in the distribution from 2016 to 2021. That looks at the effect of the tax and transfer system in affecting distribution. And the taxes and transfers do reduce and mitigate inequality, but what we show in that report is that our projection is that they will do less to attenuate inequality, both the transfer system and the tax system. And this is the characteristics of the 2017 Tax Act. And as the economy improves, means-tested transfers will tend to fall away. So there's some good news that stronger growth at the bottom of the distribution means people are getting fewer benefits, but it means the transfer system is doing less. And we're doing other work on distribution where I'd be happy to come and talk to you, talk to your staff about what we have in train over the coming year. We should come talk to you also about work we could do that's focused on the communities of color, as you say. We have we're working on housing, where affordable housing is a particular challenge. We work on healthcare. I'm trying to think of what we have in the pipeline that's public. I can't think of anything in particular focused on the communities you say, and that is it's a gap.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would like to suggest that either we have a hearing on this issue or have a meeting or something to drill down, because thank you for being so candid and so honest, because I think we're leaving out there's a gap that we need to understand and fill if we truly are going to close the racial inequality gap. And there is a huge gap based on race and income, and we can't ignore that if we really want to ensure economic equality for all in our country.
Can I add just one more sentence here?
Please go ahead.
Which is, in some sense, it's a striking thing about the economic situation today. Whereas I talked about the budget, but the economy is doing pretty well, the unemployment rate is low, and yet there are tens of millions of American adults, not to mention children, on the sidelines, not employed. We know there's challenges of homelessness, of addiction, there's issues with opioids, mental illness. There's a lot of challenges that affect the bottom of the distribution. We have not looked at that, but that is, if that would support the committee, we certainly could.
Yes, because a lot of those challenges, though, are directly related to economic inequality and the lack of a decent wage and affordable health care and adequate housing. And so it's not, these challenges aren't separate from economic growth or economic inequality.
Okay, and we have the expertise to take this on.
Great, wonderful. We'll follow up on that.
Thank you.
Gentlelady's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director Swagel, for coming. You know, I know in South Carolina, my constituents, they don't, you know, they're not worried about 10-year budgets. They're not worried about 10-year projections. They just want to fix the spending problem. We don't have an income problem. We have a spending problem. I think you would agree to that. In the private sector, when you have a problem in your particular business, whatever that is, you deal with it at that time, and it involves cuts, and it involves a realistic look at where you are. You said earlier the CBO provides a roadmap to the policies that the House of Representatives, as it relates to a budget, comes up with. You evaluate where we are.
That's right.
It doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that we have got a financial cliff that you have alluded to. Social Security, I think, is insolvent in 2035. Medicare in Social Security in 2032.
32, that's right.
Medicare 2025.
That's right.
Two countries, basically China and Japan, own 60% of our, 41% of our debt. China is not so much a friend for our way of life or militarily. What is it going to take to rattle the cages of I guess, young people, and there are a lot of them I see here today, to put pressure on Congress to make some meaningful inroads into the problem we've got right now, which is spending? And let me just tell you, you'd alluded to it's going to take a financial crisis. Define for me what that financial crisis is and how it will get people activated to know it affects their pocketbook.
Okay, and I certainly hope it doesn't take a crisis, and that's as I think has been said a couple times, that's the challenge of acting, that there's a problem that's decades in the making and decades in the solving, and taking the first step. When interest rates are low as they are today, the cost of not acting is pretty modest. And so it might be that until interest rates start inflecting upward, that it's difficult to garner support for the difficult decisions involved.
Yeah, but the issue with it, if rates tick up, you're going to trigger inflation.
That's, in some sense, those would be the dangers of higher interest rates, inflation, the sort of negative economic impacts. And it doesn't, I mean, I worry about a crisis, again, not today, not even within our 10 years, but over the oncoming decades. There could be slower moving negative impacts if interest rates move up some, not to a crisis, but some, inflation moves up, the fiscal space, as it's been alluded to several times, diminishes. That would have a slower moving, but certainly negative impact on the nation as well.
And it can't really get any lower. The rates are very low as they sit right now, and really the only issue we face is most likely they're going up, which is going to trigger inflation, which is going to trigger, it's going to affect people's pocketbooks.
That's right. The challenge, I mean, it's both the good and the bad. I mean, it's by far the good is that the United States is still the economy that around the world people want to be in, want to invest in. People want dollar assets. We're the safe currency. When there's a problem around the world, people want dollars, people want treasury bonds.
And the trainloads of people, they're not going to Cuba. They're coming to America. The trainloads of people are not going to Venezuela. They're coming to America. They're coming here for a reason, because it represents freedom and it represents a lifestyle that they have not seen anywhere in any other country. Thank you for what you're doing. I hope you can concentrate on things that make a real difference, and urge to the best of your ability for us to have a spine and to really have some financial accountability like we do in a small business. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director, for being here. The Federal Chairman Powell cited income inequality as the biggest economic challenge facing the United States in the next 10 years. And I want to build off of my colleague, Congresswoman Lee and Congressman Scott's questions around this. According to the Brookings Institution recent report, 53 million American workers, 44% of the entire workforce of our country, earn barely enough to live with a median annual income of $18,000 a year. Are you aware of that?
I haven't seen that number, but in some ways, it's a reflection of the inequality in income in our society.
And so when we reference this unemployment rate in your budget and economic outlook, it's imperative to this point, and thank you for agreeing to work with our committee, because income inequality is a top issue that we are trying to address throughout all of our policies. And so when my colleagues on the other side prioritize tax cuts, and we're prioritizing closing income inequality for the American people, that's the choice that we're trying to make in our policy, and we look forward to working with you. I want to ask about the tax cuts bill. The tax cuts for small businesses and middle-class families, were those permanent or temporary?
On the personal side, essentially all of the personal provisions expire in 2025, and that would include the small business, the S corporations, the pass-through entities. At the end of 2025, those would expire.
And the tax cuts for big corporations and the very wealthy, those are permanent, correct?
The corporate tax cut, that was permanent. The corporate tax provisions were permanent.
So maybe we should refer to this as the Trump's billionaire and big corporation tax cut, and not an America tax cut, because it really doesn't help the average small business owner, the average person, those 53 million Americans that I just referenced who make $18,000 a year, who represent 44% of our economy. So the issue of income inequality is very important. And another area that's very important to me personally is making sure that we are providing investments for skills training, expanding our workforce, and creating job opportunities. It's going to be real hard to move those 53 million people into better paying jobs if they don't have the skills, the workforce, the education, and the training to pursue those jobs. And we are now investing less in workforce training than we have historically. Another area that I believe, so do you believe that we still have room to invest in our nation's future around training and workforce despite some of these economic projections?
That's right, that the budget challenge is there, but it's not immediate, and the Congress has the ability to undertake initiatives such as you've set out.
So if we prioritize American workers, those who are struggling the most over big corporations, then maybe we can improve those economic outlook for those individuals that all of us represent, regardless of what part of the country. Let me turn to another area which you have talked about, which is your report on lowering prescription drug costs. As you know, the House has passed H.R. 3, the Elijah E. Cummings Lowering Drug Costs Now Act. This legislation empowers the Secretary of Health and Human Services to directly negotiate to lower the price of drugs, and it requires companies to pay rebates if price increases faster than inflation. Based on CBO's analysis of H.R. 3, how can this legislation achieve lower drug prices and reduce federal spending over the next 10 years?
So as you said, it requires the Secretary to negotiate with drug companies. We modeled that negotiation process and found that it would reduce drug prices and lead to federal savings on the order of $500 billion over 10 years. And then those—
$500 billion?
$billion, yes, sir, over 10 years. And then in H.R. 3, those resources are then used to expand dental, vision, hearing coverage, to provide some money for opioid treatment, for research at NIH, and so on. So it's used in a variety of ways.
So we take those savings by allowing Medicare to negotiate with drug companies, and we invest in increased services to Medicare beneficiaries, thereby shoring up their care and their health care.
That's what our estimate of H.R. 3 shows. That's right.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Those are the priorities that I'm continuing to fight for, not big corporate tax breaks that add more to our deficit and that do not improve our economic outlook in the long term. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here. I'm glad I'm going to pick up on H.R. 3. What else did CBO say about H.R. 3? About how many fewer cures there would be because of those price controls. It's not a negotiation. Let's not call it that. We know it's not. It's a formula for price controls on drug prices. So what did CBO say that would do to innovation?
Right, so we also carefully modeled that as well using the economic research literature, and showed that over the ensuing several decades, something on the order of 30 fewer drugs would be produced, about a 10% reduction.
So we can afford the drugs, but they won't exist. So it doesn't really matter if you can afford them because they won't exist. That's not a really good trade-off. So we're back at this conversation about the debt. And it's a good conversation to have. I'm glad we continue to have these kind of hearings. $23 trillion in debt, and then we come here and we argue incessantly about what is causing it, whether it's mandatory spending, lack of revenue, or discretionary spending. Seems to be pretty broad agreement that discretionary spending is going down as a share of GDP. We don't hear a whole lot of that in this room. What we do hear are two potential causes: mandatory spending and Trump's tax cuts. The tax cuts for the rich, as my colleagues call them. Well, they weren't just for the rich, of course. They were for everybody. When a corporation gets a tax cut, they can do things like contribute to the highest growth that we've seen in a long time in the lowest income workers' wages. Things like that, things like business investment. So of course, that kind of rhetoric is unhelpful and untrue. What we also found just by some graphs that we've seen today was, and from the CBO's own reporting, is that revenue as a share of GDP will be increasing and continue to increase in line with more or less what is historical averages as a share of GDP for revenue. So what is skyrocketing? It is mandatory spending, Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, and interest on the debt. And that's what we need to be having a conversation on. And that has come up, of course. And so let's talk about that, because there seems to be some agreement. But then that agreement quickly falls away into disingenuous rhetoric. Every time we talk about reasonable reforms to these programs, my colleagues accuse us of cutting them. There was a colleague from Michigan earlier who just couldn't help himself. I had to talk about how we planned to cut Medicare and Medicaid. It's not true. I don't know what these proposals, what they're talking about, or Social Security. Reforms are absolutely needed. But the Democrats plan at reform, and when they refer to Social Security 2100, they want to raise taxes via payroll taxes and then increase benefits to seniors. So you want to take money from millennials and Gen Z, and you want to transfer that directly to people who've had their entire lives to save and build businesses. We talk a lot about some of the issues, economic issues facing this country. My generation is facing those issues with rising housing costs, things like that are making it more difficult for millennials to prosper than prior generations. Would you agree with that general assessment?
I do, yes.
And do you think it's economically efficient to have a wealth transfer from the young to the old? Is that the most efficient?
Yeah, it's in some ways the issue of the fairness is the difficult one, and you put your finger right on it with the Social Security, and that's what our analysis of the 2100 Act shows as well, that that the people closest to retirement would come off the
And
back.
what's the best indicator of wealth as far as immutable characteristics? Is it gender, is it race, or is it age?
Well, wealth certainly increases with age. You know, education is tightly connected to income, which over time connects to wealth. And that, instead of this, to build wealth, we want to build skills and education.
Yeah, and I'll answer it for you. Well, age is by far the best indicator. Like, if you're older than me, there's a really good chance you have more wealth, right? Just from a probability standpoint. So we're never saying we want to cut seniors' benefits. That's not what we're saying, but we do have to slow the growth. And what does my generation have to give? Well, maybe I should retire later. I'm going to live longer. These are reasonable discussions to have, but taxing my generation when we're already facing things like higher housing costs and other issues, that is deeply immoral. It's also counterproductive when we're talking about growth. Maybe you could help me with this one. If we're concerned about the debt, should we do pro-growth policies or anti-growth policies? I mean, if we implemented policies that reduced our GDP growth, do we ever have a chance of solving our debt crisis?
It would make it more difficult. You know, both having a low growth environment and the debt relative to GDP would go up if the denominator is smaller, that's for sure.
Well, I'm out of time, but I had a lot of follow-ups. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, gentlemen's time has expired, and I recognize the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member for holding this hearing, and likewise, all of my good colleagues with their different perspectives. I'm sure my good friend from Texas is not suggesting that we wage a generational warfare. It is clear, however, that the issue of the discretionary, non-discretionary spending is one that I have seen millennials and Generation X and others really comprehend as an important contribution to the actual survival of this nation. So let me just say that the President's proposed budget projects FY 2020 revenues of $3.645 trillion, outlays of $4.76 trillion, leaving a deficit of $1.101 trillion. Over the next 10 years, the President proposes budgets that would cumulatively increase the national debt by $7 trillion and does not even come close to ever balancing. America's top 10% now average more than 9 times as much income as the bottom 90%. Now, I would suggest to you, to the Director, that entrepreneurial millennials and others are in the bottom 90%. They're not benefiting, and they're not in the top 10% most often. Would you say that? Millennials are not in the top 10% income. Many of them.
In general, that's for sure correct.
In general, I know that the nation's top 0.1% are taking in over 198 times the income of the bottom 90%. Does that seem like reasonable numbers that you contended?
So I'm sorry, I don't have the precise numbers, but certainly that disparity.
It is enormously different from the bottom. Absolutely. And that has continued under the leadership of this administration. So from my perspective, we are going the complete wrong way. That's mine. But let me pose some questions. I talk fast because I'm trying to get your answers in. Anyhow, by the Joint Economic Committee, let me show people that under President Obama, we were doing 227 jobs per month average. Then under this president, 191K jobs month per average. Good. He inherited the excellence of the work that was done by President Obama and the Democratic Congress. Unemployment rate, we came in some bad shape. Do you remember those years? You might not have been in, but 2009, you remember the debacle that we were engaged in? We were literally going on the flat earth and coming down. Obama then raised those numbers. And might I just get a yes to say that I didn't write these? This is Joint Economic Committee. Does that look pretty accurate? How it went up and then sort of continued? Does that look right, Mr. Director?
Absolutely. That's
all right. I just want you to be on the record. And of course, you can see that's Obama and then there's Trump. So policies, fiscal policies that take into consideration debt and also providing for those who are in need is important. Medium income, we were not doing well, and then we managed to keep going up, and blue went all the way up under Obama, and then we had another president come in and take the credit. That's my words, but I just want to note that you saw the blue going up or holding steady during those years from 2010 on to 2016. Is that accurate?
Yes, that looks accurate. We've seen rising incomes.
Yeah.
Over the past
So let me find out the present situation that we're in. What is the status of Medicaid, Social Security, and Medicare? What is the status? And then let me add this other question. What would be the value of adding to our portfolio, building up on affordable housing, building up on public housing? That's one of the elements of the millennials, doing that. And if you can, I have another question, and I'm at 104, 103. Go ahead.
Sure, I'll be fast. The challenges you've pointed at are the ones facing millennials and young people: affordable housing, in some sense, education, and how to get on the rising ladder. Housing is one that's particularly pernicious because zoning regulations, it's not a federal issue, it's a state one, but it prices people out of the market. And there are some local initiatives that they're trying to get at this. As St. Paul, Minnesota, for example, has an initiative to get at this. It's too soon to know whether it's working, but we're looking at that to say, what are the policies that will get at the challenges facing younger?
So it's likely to say, to answer those concerns about millennials, a federal embrace dealing with affordable housing and public housing would be a very important asset for them.
It could be, and of course, the particular program would be important.
As well as the fact that continuing to have tax cuts for the rich doesn't help them either.
It's a bigger picture question, of course, right? It affects the overall economy, and then it affects different people differently.
Let me just pose this question for the record. Have you ever, the CBO was started in 1974. Yes. That's just a few short years ago. Have you ever thought of the question of the African-American community in particular, and the long-term impact, maybe this will be your research, I'll get back with you on this, of the unpaid history of slavery, so that the CBO would consider a question of reparations in terms of a commission that would even study what that long-term impact is in light of the sharp disparities in the African-American community and immigrant community in particular, now into the 21st century. You ever thought about that, Mr. Director?
I don't think we have. I don't know all of the work that's been done before me, but I'll go back and find out, and we will tell you.
I will engage you on that, and my word to you is that there may be a connection with the sharp disparities that you see in the African-American population. Is that
we'll certainly look at that.
All right, thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
The gentlelady's time has expired, and now recognize the gentlelady from Minnesota, Ms. Omar, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. As you might have noticed, there's a lot of anxiety that is expressed by many of my colleagues when it comes to the income inequality and the disparities that continue to persist in our communities and in our country. We know that over the last 50 years, income inequality has gotten significantly worse. We know that wages have grown stagnant, and the richest Americans are the only ones that have been able to reap the benefits of the economic growth that we've seen in the country. In your report last month, you projected that income inequality will be greater in 2021 than it was in 2016. And so I wanted to see if you can give us an idea of how do the growing levels of income inequality affect consumption, and how would this affect the budget outlooks that you have?
Yeah. Absolutely. And what you said is correct about our report. We show greater inequality in 2021. That has different effects on the economy and the budget. The budget is a little difficult to parse out just because the progressive nature of our tax code means that income at the top is taxed more than income at the bottom. So I can't off the top of my head say what it means for the fiscal situation. And of course, there's negatives, right? Inequality means more spending on transfers and things like that. For the economy, it's a challenge, and it's an important long-term challenge that we know that inequality doesn't have just these short-term effects, but over time, it means a weaker economy and a weaker society. The children of families at the bottom have more difficult situations and worse trajectories. And that, in some sense, is an intergenerational transmission of inequality and of poverty. That's a key challenge for the nation.
Yeah, and as a millennial, speaking of millennials, I am the sponsor of a bill to cancel out student debt. And I recently saw that one of the ways that we can increase income inequality by like 50% was getting rid of student debt. What are other ways that we can decrease income inequality and increase the ability for millennials to be able to have the ability to have an input in our economy?
Okay. So I would look in some sense at the short term and the longer term. The short term, the tax and transfer system affects inequality. The taxes and transfer reduce inequality, but as you pointed out, in 2021, less than in 2016. So more could be done in the short term with either taxes or transfers. Over a longer horizon, the challenges are in some sense more difficult and slower. Education would be a key one, and then all the challenges that sort of help people use their education for their future. Housing, transportation, childcare, elder care, all the things that would make it possible for people at the bottom to work and to have a rising wage profile.
And an ability to stimulate the economy as well.
Exactly.
It was really unfortunate to see many of my colleagues using this hearing to be able to go after Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and to advocate for us to utilize our resources in putting more money in the pockets of the wealthy. I know that we have a national debt problem, and if we are not being creative in the ways that we are prioritizing our resources, we will continue to be in trouble. And so there is an opportunity for us to create a priority where we are lifting people up in order for us to avoid the kind of crises that we can foresee. So thank you for being here. Thank you for having this hearing, Chairman.
Gentlelady's time has expired, and now the moment we've all been waiting for. The ranking member is recognized for 10 minutes.
I have to admit, I forgot, you said at the beginning that you would go last, and I have to admit, I forgot that until just now, so.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, again for having the hearing. Dr. Swagel, thank you so much for your willingness to do this work of the Congressional Budget Office. And let me be the first here today to point out this staff over here, these reliable people that occupy the floor over there in the Ford building that do such a great job. And we're just honored to have you in doing this work. I know you get maligned sometimes, and if members of Congress don't agree with whatever you produce, you know, you take all the arrows. But I, for one, and I know I speak for my chairman here, we just appreciate the work of the CBO. As I was sitting here, it was apparent to me that you're kind of like the creamy part of the cookie, getting squeezed by both sides. And I love Oreos. So, but your willingness to do that, a bit unfair. There's enough stink on this deficit and debt issue to go around this room and around the Congress and around previous Congresses and previous presidents, left and right. We have all, on both sides of the aisle, failed on the Congress side in our Article I responsibility, and we continue to do that. But it's not my point necessarily to sit up here and throw arrows at the other side. There's plenty of things that we've done over time that have contributed to this problem. But deficit and debt has been the constant theme in this hearing today, and there's a lot of things contributing to it, to include the fact that when our friends on the other side took control of the House of Representatives a little over a year ago, they said they were going to reinstitute PAYGO. And PAYGO has been waived now how many times, Mr. Director?
I don't know, but
let me help you.
I signed the cost estimates, and I see it's
24.
Yep.
24 times. And here just a moment ago in this very hearing, with deficit and debt being the central theme of what we're talking about here today, here's one of our colleagues on the other side that's talking about a bill that she has sponsored to just basically allow the taxpayers to pay all this student debt. You know how much that is?
It's multiple tens of billions at least, if not hundreds of billions.
It's a pretty sizable bubble.
Yep.
Would that help or hurt the deficit and the debt situation that we have today?
It would make it much larger.
It'd make it a lot larger, exponentially larger. So the point of my remarks here is to call on the Congress to do its job, and that begins with doing a budget resolution and putting the entire package on the table. It's not just discretionary spending. As I said in my opening today, in 1965, discretionary spending was about 34%, or about mandatory spending was about 34% of the federal pie. Today, it's about 70%, so it's double that. And that's what's squeezing all of the opportunities for this Congress to fund the national priorities, to include national security, which I would argue is, it's in the Constitution, so we have to do that. We can debate how much, but our ability to make, to fund transformative research, to do all of the things that the Congress would like to do is dependent on us being able to solve for this whole deficit and debt issue. And so mandatory spending as a percentage of GDP continues to grow higher. Discretionary spending as a percentage of GDP continues to go lower. And I don't think you need a better metric than that to explain, as old Willie Sutton said when he was robbing those banks back in the 1950s, you got to go where the money is, and the money's on the mandatory side of spending. So I just want to make sure that that point is in the record. And obviously, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act has been a central focus of some of the arrows thrown our way here. And I'm not going to delve too deeply into that, but to say that you have to, in terms of economic productivity, you got to put a lot of things in that basket to include regulatory programs, policy issues voted on by Congress, taxes, and on and on and on. So, unfortunately, we're in an extremely good position right now with the economy growing the way it is. But relative to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, I want you to comment specifically on what it has done to impact, in my judgment, positively on the entitlement programs that we pay into. So can you explain very briefly how the creation of new jobs has allowed for us to buy a little bit more time in these social safety net programs because they're the ones paying into them?
Yes, and we see that in a variety of ways. I'll start with one particular one, and that's on disability. The Disability Trust Fund a couple years ago was projected to to run out within the next few years, and now that's been pushed back. It's outside of our budget window, it's outside the 10-year window, and that's because disability claims, the rate has gone down. The number might be up, but the rate has gone down. It's probably a reflection of the strong economy that's drawn people back in. So in some sense, right, there's these kind of micro effects, and then of course the stronger economy leads to higher wages and more contributions to the various programs, trust funds as well.
What about low-income workers?
So we've seen particularly strong wage growth at the bottom of the distribution, and then we've seen...
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. I believe I've heard from more than one of my colleagues on the other side that it only helped the millionaires and the billionaires. Am I hearing the CBO director say that maybe the lowest quintile of workers are benefiting?
We are seeing the strong job market. One particularly noteworthy aspect of it is at the bottom, the strong wage growth. There's different measures, but we are seeing wages rise, at various times, different measures, anywhere from 4% to 5%, which we haven't, we haven't seen in some time.
Yeah. Well, I make my point, and I'm going to yield here back to the chairman here in just a minute. I just want to make this last comment that there's a reason why we're in this fix right now, and we can blame it on taxes, we can blame it on a lot of other things. I certainly think that the metrics show that spending is out of control, particularly when you look at the revenues of the federal government being within that, like, what'd you say, 30 or 40 or 50-year average, and that spending is outside that window, particularly on the mandatory side. It is possible maybe that we have overpromised our country to its people.
That's one of the challenges we face. That is something one of my predecessors, Doug Elmendorf, used to focus on as well, is that the tension between what we're willing to pay and what we as a society expect out of our government. And that's the challenge.
So most politicians don't like to raise taxes, and most politicians don't like to cut benefits that currently accrue to certain people. But at the end of the day, when you have $1 trillion deficit, as far as the eye can see, something's got to give. And if there is one part of that equation that seems to be growing exponentially out of control, which is now commanding 70% of all federal spending, mandatory spending, it tells me that we've got to muster the courage and the will as a Congress to put those solutions on the table, have a robust debate on them, and make the decisions today that can save these programs and future generations. And let me just add, Mr. Chairman, if the whole plan was to cut Medicare, as has been advanced by some critics, then the best thing to do is do nothing, because it gets cut on its own in about 5 or 6 short years.
That's right.
If the plan is to cut Social Security, then the best plan would be to do nothing, because in 2032 or 2033, which is before my youngest grandson is even going to have a driver's license, the program is going to get cut on its own. The fact is, Republicans and Democrats have to start behaving more like Americans and deciding what we've got to do now to solve the problems today, rather than kick that can down the road and put it on future generations. And with that, I'll yield back my time.
I thank the ranking member, and I now yield myself 10 minutes. And I'd like to begin, also thank you, Dr. Swagel, for your time and your responsiveness. As I mentioned in my opening statement, thanks again to all the great people doing the work important work at CBO. I'm going to address this at a later date more extensively, but since my colleagues continually bring up the fact that we have not passed a budget resolution, which is true. And by the way, the Republican Senate has not passed a budget resolution either and doesn't intend to. But we did pass a budget last year. We passed a 2-year budget, the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2019. We headed off the thread of austerity cuts that were in the Budget Act of 2011. And I think we set the stage for some strategic investments in our nation's future. So, my question would be to those who worry about the fact that we haven't passed a budget resolution, how would the world be different if we had from what it is today? And again, I'm going to address that at a further date. But I want to continue the discussion of mandatory spending because I take a little bit of a different perspective on it. There's no question that it is the biggest driver of our deficit right now, all the mandatory spending categories. But we tend to forget that mandatory spending goes into the economy. In Medicare and Medicaid, it supports our hospitals, it pays our nurses, it pays our doctors, it pays pharmacies. It does a lot of things that would have to be done in some other way if the money didn't come through the government. And we know that it's roughly 18%, all healthcare spending is roughly 18% of the economy. In my district, for instance, Humana's based in my district. They are one of the biggest Medicare Advantage providers. It's about 65% of their revenue and most of their profit. They employ 12,000 people in my district. So it's not the money that's thrown away. This is money that goes into the economy. And I'm going to get to a point. But say, as some people might prescribe, and I know in the president's budget and in prior Republican budgets, there was a notion to cut Medicaid by 30% and so forth. If you were to cut mandatory spending by 30%, what would that do to the economy?
Right, so there'd be the negative impacts that you've highlighted, the sort of near term, it's like the opposite of a Keynesian stimulus. Would be taking support out of the economy. That would be offset to some extent by lower interest rates and sort of the opposite of the crowding out we might expect with budget deficits. But a large, abrupt change like that would certainly have a negative effect in the near term.
Right. So when you look at the biggest problems with those mandatory programs, the way I look at it, people are living longer. More people are living longer because we've got the baby boomers who are now in retirement age. And the structure of the programs was established at a time when the demographic situation was much different and the employment situation was much different. So when Social Security was created, the average life expectancy was right at 62, as I recall. So on average, nobody got their benefits. There were 13 people working for every beneficiary. Now that number's around 2 and dropping. And the average life expectancy is much higher. And the tax rates were set at a time when, if you're at 65 now, and you're going to receive on an average $11,000 or $12,000 worth of benefits a year, healthcare benefits, that's what the average expenditure per person is, you didn't pay anything near that over your working life. So when we talk about reforming the mandatory programs, one area we can't do anything about, we're not going to have mass euthanasia in the country, and we don't want to do that. So we're talking about the structure. That's what Simpson Bowles tried to get at some years ago, and politically that was untenable. But just to put that in perspective, it's not simple saying we're going to do something about mandatory spending in this country, because it is an essential part of the economy and the life of many of our citizens. I also want to address the issue of the income growth level. And I have a question here. The figures are the lower quintile of the population has seen their incomes rise at a very high rate. Of course, they're starting from a very low rate. And my question is, have you been able to ascertain whether that growth had, what component of that growth was due to tax cuts and demand for versus just demand, natural demand for labor and shortage of labor in those categories, and also the fact that a lot of jurisdictions around the country, states and localities have raised their minimum wage.
Right. So we have not parsed that out. We know the overall strong economy has created labor shortages that, in a good way, drive up wages for the benefit of workers. We can't parse out how much is the tax cut. And it varies by locality as well, as does the minimum wage. So we haven't parsed out how much is the increases in minimum wage and what's going on at the bottom. I think we know that it's real. And so the strong economy is driving incomes at the bottom, but we just can't parse out the different factors.
Have you done any work as to what a raise in the national minimum wage, an increase in the national minimum wage would mean to the economy and to the deficit if you raised it to $12 or $15?
We have not. We have done an analysis on the impact on employment and on poverty and things like that. And there's some, good and bad. It would, bring us, several million people out of poverty, probably reduce employment by several million jobs. So some back and forth. We haven't done the kind of dynamic or the macro analysis that you're pointing at. It's something we've been thinking about, but that kind of dynamic analysis is very intensive in our resources, and we haven't gotten there yet.
Right. Well, I think we're going to need to do that because eventually we're going to raise the minimum wage at the national level at some point. We've heard the word sustainable from both sides throughout this hearing today, and sustainable is not a precise term. I don't think it's a precise term. We had a hearing not too long ago with 4 economists, and the issue of what's the sustainable debt level, how much does debt matter, was made it clear that nobody really knows what sustainable means. But does take your concept, whatever it is, of sustainability, does putting our budget on a sustainable path require balancing the budget?
No, it doesn't. It means bringing the deficit down low enough so that the debt level doesn't continue to rise. And that does not require a balanced budget, because as long as GDP is growing, we can run a deficit without increasing the debt to GDP level, which is probably what matters. That's the best measure of our capacity.
2 specific things that were in your report that I want to just mention. One is that you said you calculated the loss in corporate revenue. You've revised your estimate as to how much corporate tax revenue will be lost under the 17 Act.
That's right.
Is that right? Would you tell us what that was?
It's about $110 billion over 10 years. And it's partly from changes in the data that the macroeconomic data on what of our overall GDP is wages and what is corporate profits was changed in a way that looks like there's more wages and less profits. Corporate profits are the base for the corporate tax. So just knowing there's less corporate profits means our estimate of future revenue will be lower. And then there's some on the international side that Mr. Doggett alluded to, where the guidance from the administration, the IRS, and the Treasury, in some ways was more taxpayer-friendly than had been anticipated in our initial estimates.
Thanks. And finally, you made a calculation as to what effect on the average citizen the tariff policy of this administration, or the tariff actions, I should say, of this administration have made to their disposable income?
We have, yes.
What was that number?
So we see that as this year, 2020, the tariffs put in place since 2018 are costing each American family about $1,277. So that comes from higher prices feeding into the economy, and it's the equivalent of taking away $1,277.
So the Chinese did not pay for the tariffs?
The impacts are many, but that's the impact on the American family.
Well, I thank you. I'm going to surrender a few seconds of my time, and once again, thank you for your candor and your responsiveness and your time and your work on an ongoing basis. So unless there's any further business, this hearing stands adjourned.